Okay, we're looking at our branches of government set up in the Constitution of the United States, and we're looking at the different um, powers and what each of the branches of government, what they have, what powers and responsibilities they have, and how each branch has checks and balances. So we did this on each other, and we did this last lecture a little bit. We're going to take a little bit more in-depth look at each of the branches of government. So pretty quick. So let's take a look at it. You have three branches of government. The first is the executive, then the legislative and judicial. They're not an order of power, so don't get caught up with that. Each has their own responsibilities. As mentioned here, the executive branch is headed up by the President of the United States. His duties are to enforce the federal laws and recommend new ones. So he's responsible for enforcing federal law. He doesn't get to choose which federal laws he's going to enforce. If it's a law, he's told to enforce it. And then he can recommend new legislation, but remember, he doesn't make legislation, he enforces it. He's the leader of our armed forces, our Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. And then he is the representative for our entire country to other leaders from other foreign states of countries. People that are going to help the president. When Washington came home one night from a party, George Washington, in his kitchen, he was meeting with a group of people, and they were discussing how you're going to go about running a government. And Washington was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. So they were probably sitting over a late night eating a sandwich when he said, I'm going to appoint you guys to be a part of my cabinet. And voila, there you have it. The president's cabinet is there to help carry out the jobs and the laws of the United States. So he's ultimately responsible. The buck stops with the president, but as far as like being the head of the Secretary of Transportation, he appoints somebody that heads up that avenue, that group for transportation, and then says, okay, you're responsible. So air traffic control, railroads, truckers, and our federal highway and freeway system. That's somebody else, and then they're going to direct it back to him. In addition to that, he has the vice president that heads up him and his cabinet, head up the people that are going to help carry out the policies and laws that are passed. The vice president is also the head of the Senate, so he's the president of the Senate. And then he takes over if the president can't serve his job any longer, if he's incapacitated somehow. The leader of each one of the departments, which we'll get into in just a second, are called secretaries. And these secretaries make up the cabinet. So let's take a look at the cabinet. You have 14 positions. You have the Department of Education, which is probably the most controversial. There's a lot of people that would like to do away with the Department of Education. They believe the founders felt like education should be done at the local level, not at the national level. They provide money for public schools. They also make recommendations on what it should cost to go to higher institutions. They want to make sure that they're enforcing the laws, that there's equal access of education to all types. So white, blue, green, purple, black, women, children, cats, dogs, all those get an opportunity to go. Next is the Department of Transportation. As mentioned before, they're in charge of highways and freeways and how you're going to go about making new ones and how the trucks and cars, and so you're going to decide when you can put on snow tires. You're going to decide what you can put on the roads to help make sure that they're not filled with ice and that. And they're going to do railway system. They're going to do our water ports and our waterways, and they're going to do our air traffic control and our gas lines and that. Department of Agriculture does all of the farming, and they'll set up farming practices. And sometimes they do protective pricing on goods. Next is the Department of Treasury. So they're going to be the ones that are responsible for collecting taxes. They're going to be the ones that make money. They recommend ways to help the economy run more smoothly. They're very, very important in that. They, as I made mention, manufacture coin and money. Next is the Department of Defense. They're good with guns. They're big and good with guns. They provide the military force that protects our country. Department of Health and Human Services. They're the ones that issue health alerts. So if there's an outbreak of something, they're the ones that would come in and determine whether or not that's safe for kids to go to school, whether or not they have to do a quarantine, whether or not something is healthy or not healthy. They conduct medical researches to prevent diseases and assure the safety of food and drug. Department of Energy researches the development of energy systems and whether or not we should be moving towards something or whether or not we should keep our oil supply at a certain level of production. The other ones are Commerce, Justice, Labor, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Interior, that's land, Veterans Affairs and Homeland Security, and then Secretary of State. Next, after you have the executive branch, you have the judicial branch. The judicial branch is made up of a court system, and the head of the court system is the Supreme Court. They're the highest court in the land. They're completely independent from, make sure you know that, say it again, completely independent from any pressures from the legislative or the executive branch. They were established by Congress. All federal courts are established by Congress. And typically courts are going to decide what the law actually means. Okay, so the right to bear arms. Okay, what does that mean according to the Constitution? And the law and the judicial branch will say the right to bear arms includes a firearm. It doesn't include a tank or a bazooka or a nuclear weapon. And then they're going to say how the laws are applied. Are they applied at the local level? Are they applied at the federal level? And then they decide whether or not a law breaks the Constitution of the United States. If you're not going to sell something and you're a public business and you're not going to sell something to a specific person or a group of people, I'm not going to sell it to, left-handed people, or I'm not going to sell it to minorities. I'm not going to sell it to women. Are the Boy Scouts of America legal because they're discriminating against women? Or is that possible that you can have that? They're going to be the ones that decide that. The Supreme Court cases get 1 million of them given to them every year, but they hear very, very few. I would say it says 80 to 100 cases. I think they're less than that. I think you're more along the lines of 50 to 70. There are 9 Supreme Court justices. One of those 9 will be called the Chief Justice. That guy's name is Mr. Roberts. The justice of the Supreme Court are appointed by the president. They are approved by the Senate, and they serve a life term. As I mentioned to all 3 classes last week, I really truly believe one of the reasons why Mr. Trump is considered to be so dangerous is that the age of our Supreme Court justices are getting up. And he's already appointed 2, and I would say if he gets elected again, he's going to appoint 2, maybe 3. And if the Senate is controlled by the Republicans, that means conservative judges are going to be appointed, and that's going to change the court for 30, 50, 100 years. And if you're a liberal, that's not something you're real excited about. So I think that's one of the biggest reasons why they're opposed to him so much. The last branch is the legislative branch. It's made up of 2 branches. This was a compromise that Mr. Sherman wrote when the founding fathers put together the Constitution of the United States. The legislative branch has a House of Representatives and a Senate. The House of Representatives is made up, each of them are made up from your state, but one is made up based off of your state's representation. So the more people you have living in your state, the more representation you get. The other one is based off of equal representation. That's called the Senate. The Senate is every single state gets 2 senators. Congress meets at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Notice Washington, D.C. is not a part of the state. It's part of what we call the District of Columbia. And its primary duties are the legislative branch is to write, debate, and pass bills. And then the president signs those bills into law, or he can veto it, and then it can be overridden again. to turn it into a law if it's voted by 2/3 of the House that voted on it. Oops. The House of Representatives is the first house. That's called the lower house, and it's based on the number of people living in each state. Therefore, the more people that live in your state, the more representation. State of Idaho doesn't have that many people. We have about 1.6 million people. We have 2 representatives. State of California, I believe, has 42 million people. They have a lot more than us. They have more people in a bathroom than we do in our entire state. We have 1.6, they have 42 million. They have 51 or 53 representatives. We have 2. So the lowest is 1 delegate. The most is California, and then New York. Each one of the members of House of Representatives serve a 2-year term, and then after every 2 years, they go back up for re-election. You want to become a representative? Well, really, the requirements aren't that hard. You got to be 25 years of age. You've had to be a citizen for 7 years, and you have to live in the state you represent. It's not that much. So you don't have to be a natural-born citizen. You only have to live in your state for the last 7 years, and you got to be 25 years of age. These are the formal rules. There are not a lot of 25-year-old members of the House of Representatives. There's a lot older than that. How about the Senate? Well, the Senate is made up of all 50 states, and unlike the House of Representatives, this is based off of equal representation. Each state, whether you're the largest in California or the smallest in Wyoming, you get 2 senators. Okay, there's a total of 100 senators. Those of you that are mathematicians, 50 times 2 comes up with 100. Carry the naught, plus 1 naught. Yeah, there we go, 100. That means that every single state gets 2, and for us to pass a law, you have to get 51 senators to vote on it. Senators serve a 6-year term. So members of the House of Representatives are elected for 2 years. The president's elected for 4 years. Member of the Senate gets elected for 6 years. They represent the entire state, whereas a member of the House of Representatives represent a district of the state. You want to become a senator? Well, you got to be 30 years of age. So you got to be 5 years older than a House Representative, and you have to live in the state for the last 9 years. Okay, again, not a lot of 30-year-old senators. Most of these guys are 50 and 60 years old, and they're usually predominantly wealthy people, gone to Ivy League schools, well-educated, well-known. They've got connections. But that's all it is by rule. What are some of the special duties of the legislature? In addition to making laws, the House and Senate will have some extra duties. The Senate is the one that's going to ratify or vote in a treaty that the president passed. So the president passes a nuclear agreement with China. The Senate has to agree to ratify it before it goes into effect. If the Senate does not agree to ratify it, much like the Treaty of Versailles or the League of Nations, excuse me, is a better example, League of Nations, after World War I, Woodrow Wilson, it was never ratified. The Senate said, no, we're not doing it. They also approved the presidential's appointees to cabinet and to the Supreme Court. And if an official, like the president, is found to have done something wrong and he's been impeached by the House of Representatives, they will put him on trial. The president of the United States, probably this week, will be put on trial for only the 3rd time in our country's history, if they choose to actually impeach him. The House of Representatives, they can recommend tax bills to become laws, which is big. So for a bill that has revenue in it and it wants to raise a tax, it always has to start in the House of Representatives. So most bills are going to start in the House. They decide if a government official has done something that warrants a trial. So they can go out and take a look and say, yeah, this guy's done this. And in this case, Mr. President, President Trump has overstepped his bounds, and they're going to hold him accountable, and they're going to recommend that the Senate put him on trial. That's called an impeachment. Okay. Initially, here's one. Initially, you guys probably didn't know this. The capital was in Philadelphia, but in the War of 1812, Oh, was it the War of 1812 that they burned it to the ground and we move it? Um, I have to go back and look at that. I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, initially when it was uh, Capitol was in Philadelphia, the House and the Senate met in what we call Independence Hall, and the Senate met on the upper floor, and the House of Representatives met on the lower floor. And to this day, you still call the Senate the upper house and the Senate or the House of Representatives the lower house. So that's just a little tidbit of information. Okay, we're going to stop there and we're going to do a little bit with a film. So hang in there. You're going to make sure you know this for our test, which is coming in after Christmas.